Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on your time zones. Welcome to APEC Virtual Tour 2020. I'm Maaz Khan, and we'll be discussing about Bastion servers on Oracle Cloud infrastructure. Let me give you a quick introduction about myself. I am an Oracle Apps DBA with 9 years of experience. Recently, I've been recognized as Oracle Ace. My core areas of expertise include Oracle Cloud, Oracle E-Business Suite, Oracle Database Administration. I frequently contribute to Oracle communities like OTA, my Oracle Support Community, and Oracle Cloud Customer Connect. You can reach out to my blog using this QR code. About the Oracle ACE program, we have 3 membership tiers. You can nominate yourself or anyone can nominate you, and the 3 membership tiers include Oracle ACE Associate, Oracle ACE, and Oracle ACE Director. The agenda of today's session will be introduction to Bastion servers and how they are deployed on Oracle Cloud infrastructure. When are we going to use them exactly? We will be discussing about like a few scenarios in such case. The most important part will be to secure the Bastion server, and we'll finally conclude with certain best practices and alternative, if any. So Bastion server, the term Bastion was used in medieval times. It was used to define a wall that was used to protect the castle from the outside. And the same term came into networking world in the 90s. And it was basically defined in the networking world. Bastion server was defined as the server which was exposed to the internet. It was used to provide access control mechanism to the resources or the services present in your private subnet. And the Bastion server typically was assigned with a public IP so that end users were able to connect to the Bastion server. Now, when it comes to OCI, we'll have a typical use case here wherein we have a customer tenant. Suppose we have the region as Jeddah. The VCN, like you can see, is 10.3.0.0. And we have 2 subnets here, the public subnet and the private subnet. And they are defined into 2 different compartments, a networking compartment and a compartment, say comp1. So your Bastion server is placed here in your public subnet. It will be having a public IP as well as a private IP. And this Bastion server will be used to connect to your private subnet resource. Like in my case here, it's a DB compute instance. So I would not want this to be exposed to the internet. So what I'll be doing is I'll be using Bastion server to connect to my database compute instance in a secure manner through the internet gateway. So configuration of a Bastion server on Oracle Cloud is similar to configuring any compute instance. Like we have the latest Oracle Linux image. The CPU, say I define as just 1 for now. I give 16 GB of RAM, and I would be tweaking the security list here, wherein I'll make sure the TCP protocol and port 22 for SSH is open and available at 2 endpoints. The first one will be at the public subnet, and the second one will be at the private subnet. I can optionally also enable ICMP so that I'm able to ping from the Bastion server from over the internet. Well, let's understand a few terminologies before we move further. SSH tunneling is nothing but an encrypted channel or an encrypted tunnel, and it uses SSH protocol connection. SSH agent is nothing but an OS level program. It runs in the background and it stores your keys in the memory. We have 2 options here, to basically start the SSH agent. The first one will make sure the SSH agent runs in the background, but this this command will have an OS level program running in the background, and we need to make sure that we terminate it manually. While the second one, it will terminate automatically when we log out from the particular shell. Once we have the agent running, we will be adding a private key, and this private key will be stored in the memory. The SSH-add option will help us do that. Understanding what is port forwarding. Port forwarding, basically, it is nothing but mapping an external port to an internal IP address and port. So say you have SSH running on port number 22. So port allows devices to run particular services, and we have three types of port forwarding: the local port forwarding, the remote port forwarding, and the dynamic one. We'll be focusing primarily on the local port forwarding, wherein if we have if we are planning to forward a port from Windows machine to Linux machine, we can do that using certain tools like Putty or Term. While if we want to forward a port from on-premise Linux machine to a Linux machine on cloud, we'll be using the -L option, like you can see here. And like in my case, I am forwarding a port 17621 to a protected server, who's on like a protected server on port number 22. And I'll be using Bastion server as the SSH tunnel here. IP forwarding is basically a configuration setting done on your Bastion server to make sure the IP packets are forwarded from the Bastion server to the respective servers on the private subnet. So this is nothing but a sysctl configuration parameter change. We enable it and we can use IP forwarding. This is basically, we use this for when we are creating SSH tunnel or we are using a proxy command. We'll discuss what is a proxy command further in the further slide. Now, understanding how we basically connect an on-premise Linux machine to using the proxy command option. Let's understand this typical scenario. We have a client Linux machine, we have a Bastion host, and we have 3 protected servers. Suppose Tom, he tries to connect from the client machine. He'll be storing 3 private keys with passphrase, of course, and he'll be, like we discussed, he'll be just spawning an OS program SSH agent, and he'll add that particular private key. Once the private key has been added, he can use that particular private key to connect to the Bastion server, followed by connecting to the protected servers. So we have already made sure that the public keys are in place on both the Bastion server and protected servers, and we make sure the IP forwarding has been enabled. All we need to do is just run the SSH-j command. The -j is like the proxy command option. It allows us to connect to the protected server, which is in our private subnet, using the Bastion server. Again, we'll be using the secure or the auth.log files to monitor the connectivity on the Bastion server from the end user connectivity to the Bastion servers. The second use case here is like how we are going to connect from a Windows machine to a Linux machine using an SSH tunnel. So it involves basically 3 very simple steps. The first one will be assigning a public IP, followed by we make sure the private key has been the correct private key has been assigned here for the connectivity, and the third option will be port forwarding. So we make sure the local ports are mapped correctly to the ports which are open and the services are available onto the protected servers. Like if you can see this, in my case, I have mapped 3 ports, the first one being 22 for SSH connectivity, the second one 5903 it will be for a VNC session, and the third one, port 80, will be for Apache HTTP server. So when are we going to use a Bastion server? Initially, when we want to have certain comparison for a few workloads, and we need to make sure that the customers can check the workloads and compare them from on-premise and on cloud, we need to have certain POCs done. So in those scenarios, it is initially very difficult to have the customer premise equipment configured on day one. Like the reason why I'm saying this is because the IPSec VPN supports around 14 devices, then we have 10 different vendors. And this connectivity the steps needs to be done at the networking level, and we need to do certain tweaks in the on-premise CPE device. And these steps are different for every single vendor, every single device. So what happens is if we have a Bastion server, it will be a very quick and secure way to access the OCI resources from an on-premise environment of the customers. Let's understand what is a loopback address before we further get into a few more scenarios and on where and how we are going to use the Bastion server. So loopback address is nothing but a virtual interface. It is a software construct. It does not correspond to any network hardware. It leads back to the host itself. And commonly assigned IP here is 127.0.0.1. And what happens is like the loopback address is not routed to the internet. So this is the most important point here. We need to understand. The scenarios with loopback address we'll just take a typical scenario. If you want to have a VNC session to a DB server, which is in our private subnet, what we do is we first create an SSH tunnel using the local port forwarding. And what we do, and the next step would be to have the VNC server, obviously the VNC server running on the DB host, and we need to make sure the ports are open at the OS firewall level, followed by the ingress private subnet security rules. Once we have this done, we can use the loopback address for local port forwarding, and the complete VNC session will be encrypted using the SSH tunnel. Similarly, we can have different other scenarios like WinSCP, we can use RDP, we can also use HTTPS for using the same use case of local port forwarding, creating an SSH tunnel like we did for VNC. Coming to the most important part is securing the Bastion server. We can have a situation wherein we would like to have this Bastion server connected to the we can connect it to the public, connected through only the customer premise equipment on premise. So in that case, we need to make sure the ingress rule for the public subnet is correctly defined. The security list is correctly defined here. We make sure the ports like TCP, SSH, TCP, the port 22 for TCP is open and available. And and optionally, we can also have ICMP for pinging the Bastion server. On the Bastion server, we'll make sure that we disable unnecessary and irrelevant users. We'll keep a count of the list of packages being installed so that we don't have any unnecessary or irrelevant package lying on the Bastion server. It is important to have or to track the SSH session logs, and we need to make sure these logs are being shipped on the OCI buckets or the OCI object storage at regular intervals. so that we can investigate further if the Bastion server itself is compromised. We can enable multi-factor authentication. This will add another security layer. It will add another security layer to your OCI connectivity. This can be done with Google Authenticator. Adding disclaimer banners for SSH logins is something we can do to make sure we can warn those malicious or unauthorized users. Now, okay, getting into the SSH session tracking and recording, we try to do this in a typical uh, uh, client and OCI connectivity use case, where what we did here was we actually have, like you can see here, we just consider one particular compartment, say, which belongs to the DevOps team, and we created a group, DevOps 01. The group and the users had one-to-one mapping. Why this was the case? Because policies are being assigned at the group level and not the not the OCI user level. So we have a user Ahmed K who belongs to a group DevOps 01, and like you can see here, we created a simple a single bucket Ahmed K for user Ahmed K. And here, once the user Ahmed K logs in, he can upload his public key. This public key was mounted uh, was mounted using S3FS on the Bastion server. And further, once we had the public key present onto the Bastion server, we could further create OS users accordingly. We were following a naming convention so that it was easy for us to create the OS level users. Now, this approach involved creating certain custom scripts, like we need to make sure that the public keys are automatically loaded from the object storage buckets. We used cron and S3FS for this. If we have any new public key uploaded at the what you can say, if we have any public key present onto, or if we have any new buckets, we create the OS user accordingly. And we also make sure the SSH sessions are being tracked. So we used the script and script replay command. We had to create, we had to manually create the access control mechanism to the private servers. This was, this was to make sure the users, like, using SSH connectivity, they were able to access, they were able to successfully have those public, they were able to successfully connect to the protected servers. We intentionally disabled IP forwarding. This was to avoid the proxy jump option. And we had to reach out to users so that they connect to the Bastion server first, and then followed by connecting from Bastion to the destination server using 2 hops. So in this scenario, this was a tedious task, because users the end user to Bastion server connectivity, we were able to do a lot of automations, but from Bastion server to protected servers, it was a manual approach, because using automation tools here was not feasible, as we were not intending to install too many packages onto the Bastion server. The logs to be shipped, we frequently made sure that the logs are being shipped onto the object storage. And of course, the housekeeping was, the script was automatically managing the housekeeping task to make sure the mount point had enough space onto the Bastion server. There were certain limitations, like you might have already observed in this approach. We were not able to do anything with the SSH tunnels. If we have, for example, if we have the IP forwarding enabled, we can easily connect through an SSH tunnel or using a proxy command. But in that case, the complete communication is encrypted, and we will not be able to have, we will not be able to track the SSH commands being run by the end user. It also involved too many, like, additional steps, manual steps, and which was a bit tedious, like storing the public key of a particular user onto the protected servers. If we are not using any automation tool, of course. Now, when it comes to the complexity, we just took a single user, single protected server. What if we have many users? What if we have many keys and many OS level users? And of course, many protected servers. So like I said, if we have n number of compartments, n number of users, and n number of buckets, this becomes a pretty complicated approach. Similarly, when we have n number of subnets, n number of resources, we have n number of OS users, like you can see in this diagram. What is a workaround in such a scenario? The workaround, we can use a third-party software like Easy Login. It will again require a set of packages to be installed on the Bastion server. Now let's understand what is multi-factor authentication on a Bastion server, and we'll be considering Google Authenticator in our scenario. So like you can see, when we enable two-factor authentication with Google Authenticator, it will add another security layer, and we'll be discussing the steps of installation of the Google Authenticator further. We have a few steps that need to be done onto the server, followed by certain steps we need to do onto our mobile devices. So implementing two-factor authentication is pretty simple. It requires certain dependency packages to be installed for the Google Authenticator, followed by installing the Google Authenticator RPM onto the Bastion server. What we need to do is, once we have the RPM installed on the Bastion server, we do a few certain configurations onto the server side, followed by installation of the app on the client side. And once we have the app done, we scan the QR code. We make sure we document the emergency scratch codes provided by Google Authenticator. Once we have the SSH configuration done to make sure the Google Authenticator is being used as the two-factor authentication, we can later on just test that verification code. There are certain prerequisites. The Google Authenticator, we make sure the timestamp is synchronized for both the server and the client, because the authentication factor for GA is time-based, one OTP. And we also need to make sure that the pre-steps for the first login of OS users to set up the Google Authenticator are being performed. So now, understanding the best practices for having a Bastion server on OCI, the first one, of course, would be using a passphrase for private key. We make sure that we use strong passwords for the passphrase when generating the key pair. Having the -X option will, lock your agent for a particular private and public key pair, I mean. Network security rules, we need to keep a watch on those security rules, the ingress rules for the security list. Again, we need to make sure the OS firewall rules are in place, and only the relevant ports and port protocol are open and available. Now, Bastion hardening, we need to make sure we have two-factor authentication, like we discussed earlier. We remove irrelevant packages, we limit the OS user access, and we make sure the logs and the SSH sessions are being managed, and they are being tracked, and they are being logged, and on a timely basis, they are being shipped to the object storage. Again, Bastion server is an optional networking component. It is recommended for initial POCs, as it is very easy to deploy a Bastion server. But IPSec VPN and fast-edge connectivity solutions are the ideal solutions to connect from on-premise to OCI. Bastion becomes complicated. Monitoring and managing Bastion server becomes a complicated scenario when we have more number of users. Again, this point is very important. Like we must avoid using the -g option when we are creating a tunnel, because the -g option, what it will do is it will do the port binding, and it will do the port binding for all the network interfaces. So this is something we would not want to um, uh, allow the end users to do that. So and the recommended one, or the default one, is the mapping that has to be done to the loopback address. So loopback address is actually local to itself, to the host itself. And once we have the one machine, the one machine's loopback address, it can never contact to any other loopback address of another machine. So whenever we create an SSH tunnel, it is important that we map it to the loopback address and not all the network interfaces. Okay, do we have any alternative for a Bastion server? Yes, we do. We have an image for Open VPN access server as a in our OCI. We can use this, but it is limited, of course, for 2 user profiles. It will provide a better access control mechanism. You can have those SSH sessions, and you can manage those logs in a pretty better way. But again, we are limited to 2 free users. We will require the bring your own license option. If we want, we will have to purchase any further licensing. We'll have to reach out to OpenVPN, and then we can have more number of users using the we can have more number of user profiles. Okay, what if I already have an IPSec VPN in place, and can I still use a Bastion server? Yes, we can. We can use it to monitor the SSH activity, like the SSH. If we would like to log those SSH connections, we can use a Bastion server. The Bastion server can simply be there behind a NAT gateway, and what we can do is, yeah, we can also have a centralized access control mechanism onto the Bastion server, where we can easily manage the key pairs. Again, we need to keep a note that SSH tunnels and proxy commands cannot be monitored if IP forwarding is enabled, because in that case, the whole communication is encrypted. My concluding thoughts in this, when it comes to Bastion server on OCI, it is a quick and secure way to connect to the OCI. It is very crucial, it is very important to secure and make sure the logs are being shipped to the object storage from your Bastion server. And we can use Bastion server to leverage access control mechanism for the key pairs. That's it from my side. And thank you everyone for connecting to this session. If you have any suggestions, any questions, any comments, please share them below this recording, as this is a pre-recording. This is a pre-recorded session, and I would like to thank APEC Virtual Tour 2020 sponsors, Francisco, and everyone who has been actively involved in making this huge event a success. Thank you, everyone. You can reach out to me over LinkedIn. I'm available over LinkedIn. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.